So in yoga, we have the idea of the big problem and the little problem that we experience inside of ourselves. So we're going to talk about this today. So what on earth is the big problem and the little problem? Well, we'll start with the little problem. We recognize, don't we, that on this path, it's not like thoughts are our enemies. We recognize that, don't we? Because we want a healthy relationship with the mind. And we know that we're not here to control the mind. We're here to do the gritty work to purify it. And that's why it's good to have a life that is in alignment with access to meditation. Meaning, if we're putting a hell of a load of impurities in our body, and my word do I know I'm guilty of this, then are we going to be able to have a very still, equanimous mind? And the answer is, in essence, no. Don't even bother trying. If we don't have a lifestyle that's in accordance with that which we might call meditation, because please bear in mind, meditation isn't necessarily something that we do. Meditation is exactly what we are. We are that meditation. Now that means we're that pure, untouched consciousness inside of ourselves. And so we're wanting to bring our lifestyle into a way that is equanimous with that. And that takes training and takes time, and my word, we know it because we see it on here, I'm still in my process of doing that. It's a principle we call brahmacharya, but let's leave that for another day. For now, we want to talk about the big problem and the little problem. We recognize that the mind has certain fluctuations in it. For example, when we're at the start of our journey and we're a bit of a beginner, the mind can be very loud, and that's okay that it is, because it's just teaching us where our karma is at. Meaning, what are these afflictions or these lenses through which I see life, or the lenses through which I see myself? Are they distorted in some way? Are they foggy or unclear? And the answer most of the time is yes, and these loud thoughts are the things that are bringing our attention to those areas where I'm unclear about life or myself. But we have the big problem and the little problem. The little problem is called the little problem because not necessarily that it's easily managed, but that it's easily seen. We can be very aware of the little problem. The little problem is that of those very loud voices in the head, meaning we recognize that anxious thoughts, sad, depressive thoughts of comparison between one person, ourselves, and another, or these kind of things that elicit a seriously large, loud reaction from the body, well, they're quite obviously seen, aren't they? All right, for a while they're not. But in time, as we do our sadhana, and if you want some access to some sadhana just means your daily spiritual practice to bring about the highest aliveness of intensity of energy in the system and bring about the highest potential in your life. If you want to access some of that, there's a free introduction to Hatha Yoga down below. There's also some free breathing practices that you can sign up for. There's a free community. And there's also the Awakening coaching, which is one-to-one and private with me. And if you want to sign up for that, the application form is there for you to do so should you wish. The coaching itself isn't free though. So these things that elicit loud responses, well, they're quite obvious to ourselves, aren't they? If I'm feeling some kind of way, I can trace it back to a thought. And because these thoughts are creating quite loud emotions or inside of me, I can become quite aware of them quite easily. That's the little problem, the little mental afflictions in the mind that elicit huge responses from me. But there's a big problem. Technically, I suppose, it's taught this way, at least traditionally in the yoga, that the physical asanas, the physical movements of yoga, they will in time grind down that karma or these mental afflictions enough, because they're quite gross, they're quite dense. And so the way that we clear these is through the physical asanas. But we get to a point where most of the gross, dense stuff inside of ourselves is gone. And then comes the big problem. The big problem is these little thoughts that don't necessarily cause such a big eruption of energy in the system. So they're very subtle, but they still veer us away from truth, if this makes sense, if that's even possible. I'm not sure that it is, because we're always truth. But they do have this seeming ability to allow a belief structure to be believed into reality. Meaning, let me think of an example from my life. Sometimes we have an attachment to our identity, our ego, right? That voice inside the head. But sometimes the thoughts are so subtle. For example, a great example of this is the spiritual ego. Sometimes we'll judge another person, or we'll judge ourselves in a spiritual way, but we think it's me talking in the head, because it's such a subtle, fine form of thinking that we don't quite yet have the awareness to disidentify with it, to wedge a gap in between me and said thought. And so we're so close to it, and it's so subtle that it slips through the gaps. And this is a big problem, especially if our life work is to create peace for ourselves, because these thoughts, subtle though they are, certainly get in the way of peace. They're the ones that can cause that subtle feeling of agitation, or that subtle feeling of something's not quite right inside of our system, rather than being that wonderful, peacefully feeling, energetic being that we know ourselves to be. So this is the big problem, and the only way, it's said, to cure these, or to move through these, transcend these, is through the practice of pranayama. Pranayama means, like I said in the last video, prana means energy or life force, yama means control of, so gaining control of our life forces. But realistically, pranayamas are practices that are breathing practices, essentially, because prana also means breath. Breath and life force and energy are interconnected. You tried the free breathing practice down below. You do a few breaths and you can definitely begin to see, I'm able to manipulate my prana, my energy, my life force with breath. They're definitely interconnected. But to gain the awareness, truly, to be able to see these tiny, subtle mental afflictions, these big problem thoughts, we must be engaged in not a reasonable amount, but a reasonably focused meditation. There's 8 stages to this path that we call the yogic path. They call it the 8 steps, or the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. The first 2 are the yamas and the niyamas, which are basically the do's and the don'ts of the journey. The 3rd stage is physical asanas. So that's where we are. If we're doing just yoga itself, just the physical asanas, that's where we are. We're on the 3rd stage of the 8-stage path. The 8th stage ending with samadhi, complete union with love, or the universal, the macrocosm, whatever it is that we want to say in us. So, of course, these things begin to breed results inside of ourselves. For example, they call it an 8-stage path, but we can see results beginning to, we can see ourselves gaining momentum in certain aspects of these all of the time, meaning it doesn't mean we have to do the yamas and the niyamas and then the asanas and perfect them before we're allowed to move on to meditation, which is one of the further steps or limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga. No, we're able to, because we're doing the physical asanas, develop that ability to meditate, but it's meditation, true meditation, that we're able to bring ourselves into alignment with, that will help us solve the big problem. those little mental afflictions that we really struggle to pick up sometimes. Remember, it's not the amount of yoga that you do, it's the quality, it's the way that you've shown up for that yoga, or for the pranayamas even, to prime yourself, to get yourself into that state of being, of meditation, that will allow us to see these subtle mental afflictions. And this is then that next stage of healing. To go from the gross tensions, to work your way through all of that karma in your system, and then be left with the more subtle things that we miss. And then this is that next powerful stage of the healing journey. Most of the pain is done. Most of the deep, dark pain is done at that point. And then we have to get quite focused to notice these smaller, subtler, mental distortions. I hope this video helps. Have a great evening. Namaste.